Good evening. My name is Michael Alexander, and I am the Interim Vice President for Global Diversity and Inclusion here at Portland State University. And on behalf of President Ramad Qureshi and myself, I have the pleasure of welcoming you to this evening's event. I'd like to begin my comments by offering a land acknowledgement. It's important for us to recognize that we are gathered on occupied lands. And I want to honor those who preceded us by offering a land acknowledgement in recognition of the unique and enduring relationship between tribal communities and the land that we occupy. The Portland metropolitan area rests on traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Calumet, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Moala, and many other tribes and bands. And I ask that we take a moment to reflect on the land on which we are standing and the tribal nations whose history it represents. Thank you. This year's commencement and celebration of the work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King took on a somewhat different form. We are acknowledging his legacy over 2 nights. Last night we had the opportunity to hear from a local activist and leader, Rakaya Adams, who walked us through, I think, a very intriguing way of looking at the carryover of the impact of slavery and oppression to our current state within this country. Tonight, we have the opportunity to again focus on the words of Dr. King and to have activists, thought leaders, academics, faith community leader have us compare where we are to some of the challenges that Dr. King articulated in 1967. The speech that we will focus on was one that he gave to a group in Atlanta in 1967, where he spoke about the triple-pronged threat that each of these constructs offered. I did a little research and I found a quote from a faculty member at UC Berkeley, Hatem Bazanian, who offered the following. On August 31st, 1967, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King delivered the 3 Evils of Society speech at the National Conference on New Politics, which is the most prophetic and revolutionary address to date on the questions of militarism, poverty, and racism. Quote, "We are now experiencing the coming of the surface of a triple-pronged sickness," end of quote. Dr. King framed the problem that has been lurking within our body politic from its very beginning, identifying the sickness of racism, excessive materialism, and militarism, and considering that these 3 problems form a plague to Western civilization. Tonight we have the opportunity to listen to leaders who will give us a sense of where we are against the threat that was identified over 50 years ago. So, before we begin, I want to offer a word of thanks to the people who have been responsible for our Martin Luther King celebration here at PSU. A number of them are here with us this evening, and I would ask if members of the event committee would stand, and I know we're in a dark room, but stand, wave, say woo, do something so that we can appropriately thank you for all of the work. This work began in earnest in September, and it has been a labor of love since that time. So, thank you for being here, and we hope that you will allow us to take a very close look at where we lie as a society today against a set of challenges and considerations articulated over 50 years ago. Thank you.
Nothing but an echo of the past. Nothing but an echo of the past. The sounds of struggle you hear that are filling your world today are nothing but an echo of the past. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. The people united will never be defeated. The people united will never be defeated. They say get back, we say fight back. Get back, fight back. Get back, fight back. No justice, no peace. Echo, whoa, whoa. Echo, echo. Nothing but an echo of the past. The sounds of struggle you hear that are filling your world today are nothing but an echo of the past. No justice.
No peace.
Y'all know how it goes. No justice.
No peace.
The people united will never be defeated. The people united will never be defeated. No justice.
No peace.
They say get back. We say fight back. Get back.
Fight back.
Get back.
Fight back.
They say get back. We say fight back. Get back.
Fight back.
Get back.
Fight back.
Echo, echo, echo. Nothing but an echo of the past. The sounds of struggle you hear that are filling your world today are nothing but an echo of the past. Nothing but an echo of the past.
The American people must have an opportunity to vote into oblivion those who cannot detach themselves from militarism, and those who lead us And so we are here because we believe, we hope, we pray that something new might emerge in the political life of this nation, which will produce a new man, new structures and institutions, and a new life for mankind. I am convinced that this new life will not emerge until our nation undergoes a radical revolution of values. When machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A civilization can flounder as readily in the face of moral bankruptcy as it can through financial bankruptcy. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. We are called to play the Good Samaritans on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be beaten and robbed as they make their journey through life. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It understands that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. With righteous indignation, it will look at thousands of working people displaced from their jobs with reduced income as a result of automation, while the profits of the employers remain intact, and say this is not just. It will look across the oceans and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia and Africa only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of the countries and say this is not just. It will look at our alliance with the landed gentry of Latin America and say this is not just. A true revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of peoples normally humane, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. So what we must all see is that these are revolutionary times. All over the globe, men are revolting against old systems of exploitation, and out of the wombs of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. The shirtless and barefoot people of the earth are rising up as never before. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. We in the West must support these revolutions. It is a sad fact that because of comfort, complacency, a morbid fear of communism, and our proneness to adjust to injustice, the Western nations that initiated so much of the revolutionary spirit of the modern world have now become the arch anti-revolutionaries. This has driven many to feel that only Marxism has the revolutionary spirit. Communism is a judgment. And in a sense, communism is a judgment of our failure to make democracy real and to follow through on the revolutions that we initiated. Our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal opposition to poverty, racism, and militarism. With this powerful commitment, we shall boldly challenge the status quo and unjust mores, and thereby speed the day when every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked places shall be made straight, and the rough places plain. May I say in conclusion that there is a need now more than ever before for men and women in our nation to be creatively maladjusted. As Mr. Davis said, and I say to you that I choose to be among the maladjusted. As my good friend Bill Coffin said, there are those who have criticized me and many of you for taking a stand against the war in Vietnam and for seeking to say to the nation that the issues of civil rights cannot be separated from the issues of peace. I want to say to you tonight that I intend to keep these issues mixed because they are mixed. Somewhere we must see that justice is indivisible. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I have fought now too long and too hard against segregated public accommodations to end up at this point in my life segregating my moral concern. And so let us stand in this convention knowing that on some positions, cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And on some positions, it is necessary for the moral individual to take a stand that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but he must do it because it is right. And we say to our nation tonight, we say to our government, we even say to our FBI, we will not be harassed, We will not make a butchery of our conscience. We will not be intimidated, and we will be heard.
Good evening, folks. My name is Winston Grady-Willis, the director of the School of Gender, Race, and Nations here at Portland State University in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And we are all, as a group, profoundly honored, especially after Rukiah Adams absolutely tore down the house last night, that, how about a hand again? Right? We are absolutely honored that you would take even more time to be in dialogue, to be in a spirit of not only reflection, but a spirit of conversation with the panelists this evening. If you have a program and if you have the ability to read the program, there are brief formal bios for each of the four panelists. I'm the honor to be the moderator this evening. I want to give you a sense before everyone begins to talk that one of the things that isn't necessarily captured in the respective bios of the panelists is something that's often not put on a CV or a resume, and that's work around social justice. And so each of the individuals that stand here, or sit here rather, really represent a commitment not only in the lived experience with respect to their connection to scholarship or teaching, ministry, right? Their activism, but it's something that's just infused in each and every one of them. And so first I'm going to give you a sense of what we're going to do this evening, and then I'm going to talk about one key thread, and there's some others, but one key thread that sort of connects those of us sitting up here this evening. What's going to happen in just a minute or two, everyone is going to spend about 5 minutes to just share some reflections, some thoughts. Could be something that moved them either from the excerpt of this classic speech by Dr. King, or maybe the entire version, something from their own work, right? But everyone's going to take about 5 minutes to do that. And then after everyone does that, there's going to be a conversation among the panelists, sort of a give and take. I don't think that I'll have to do too much of anything. And then after that conversation among the panelists, about 15 minutes, if you will, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, we're going to then open it up. And this is where we really want to stress that this evening, again, is about conversation. So it's not the usual kind of static Q&A, but an opportunity for there to be some genuine give and take, not only among the panelists themselves, myself as moderator, but also with you folks who could be any number of places right now, but decided that you wanted to honor Dr. King's legacy by being here this evening. So what is that thread? There's several threads, but one thing that over the course of the past few months that has connected us in some ways, one way or another, has been a connection to honoring the life of Jason Eric Washington. Many of us have been involved in Disarm PSU activities. Many of us have been in dialogue with individuals on campus who don't take that position, right? But we respect and lift up academic freedom, and many of us, whether it's from wearing the ribbon here or the t-shirt that Professor Bates has on, have sort of made pretty clear the position that we have. But even more important, and this is where this bedrock community connection is so important. Reverend Mondainé, as many of you know, not only as a minister, as a leader of the NAACP here in Portland, but more recently, since the tragic death of Jason Washington at the hands of CPSO officers, has really been an important bridge, just doing the necessary social justice work. And so at some point, I'm sure some of the conversation will come back to this issue as well it should. President Qureshi is here, Dr. Qureshi, who's demonstrated a genuine effort to listen and really develop dialogue around this issue. Other key folks, we've got deans, just about every college. And so whatever happens, we want to lift up that thread. Another thing that I wanted to say quickly, and then I'll zip my lips for a few minutes. Some of you may have had the opportunity not that far back to go to the MLK ecumenical service that was at Vancouver First Avenue Baptist Church. And it was really an amazing event not that many days ago. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, in addition to the fact that Reverend Mondainé sang, lift every voice and sing in a way that I don't think anyone in that sanctuary has ever heard it sung before. But many of you know that the keynote speaker that evening was Attila Shabazz, the oldest daughter of Malcolm X. And one of the things that she did is she really spoke truth to power, dropped some science, was that it's really important to unpack the sort of standard, conventional narratives of these two great figures. They were great figures, but they were also part of larger social movements, right? Make no mistake about it. They were products of movements as much as they were leaders of movements. And so I think it's important, particularly given Attila Shabazz's presence just a few days ago here in Portland, and talking about the fact that her father, right, El-Hajj Malik Omawali El-Shabazz, and Yolanda King's father, right, Martin Luther King Jr., were not adversaries. They were actually individuals who communicated with one another on a regular basis, and one of the threads that connected them, again, was this bedrock notion of social justice. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to, first we'll hear from Professor Lisa Bates, and then we'll hear from Professor Tom Hastings, we'll hear from Reverend Mondainé, and then we'll hear from Professor Marisa Zapata. Again, everyone, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's so meaningful to be here tonight, speaking on these themes, to see these words and these thoughts of Dr. King highlighted here, right? For so long we have been just looking at the most neutered, the most anodyne sort of clips of Dr. King's thinking, and here we're able to really engage with his diagnosis of the origins, the causes, and the intertwined nature of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism in a way that we see certainly today reflected in the Black Lives Matter movement, and in the movement, the social and political and cultural movements that are being built today, particularly by young people. I was reflecting that this will be my 20th college graduation anniversary. And so I was an undergraduate student in the era of super predators, in the time where much of our thinking, as I studied public policy, was about cultures of poverty and dysfunction when we talked about Black folks. I remember reading Charles Murray, The Bell Curve and Losing Ground, in class as assigned reading. And the sort of innovative policy of the day for eliminating poverty was to refuse single mothers additional food stamps and welfare benefits when they had an additional child, and that would disincentivize them from procreation. And I think about, you know, the conversations that those of us who were students of color, those of us who came from working class or poor backgrounds had out in the hallway or, you know, in the library, in the study hall. And we didn't talk about that very much in class. And one of the things that I'm so proud of among our students and young people today is that they are not having it. They will not have it. Yeah. They are building a movement and understanding of race and class, as well as an understanding around gender, around patriarchy, around heterosexism, around disability, around immigrant identities, that insist that there is no cultural, social, or moral deficit of people, and particularly of Black people, right? That we have predicated so much of our thinking about how to operate in these systems, how to develop institutions, organizations, programs around the idea that there is a cultural, social, and moral deficit in Black people. And that poverty is caused by those deficits, right? And so I think it is just so powerful to recognize that the intertwined issues of race and class are not about an inability or an unwillingness to participate appropriately in our economic systems. It is a feature of our economic system that there will be exploitation because we have built and created a system of racial capitalism. And that attempting to succeed within that system will never work because it will never be allowed to work, right? And so we can recount a history of the places and times when Black people, rooted in place, created their own ownership and organizations or practiced any form of self-determination that have been dismantled, both through very direct violent actions, but also through sort of a benign paternalism, right, that says that there's something dysfunctional here and we need to take it apart, right? We need you to participate in the system over here. And what I find so powerful about today's movement building is a rejection of the notion that we need to succeed better or work harder within that system, but instead a vision that we need to transform and build an entirely new concept of how we're going to live together as communities, as society, you know, as a country. And again, I see that and I'm so inspired by how that emerges from young folks. So I think a little bit about what it is that we're doing here at Portland State. I mean, this is where I work and spend a lot of my time and energy. How can we support our students? How can we support our future students, right? These younger teens who are out and around our city who are asserting their full humanity and who are envisioning a future in which their learning and their work and their creative pursuits are truly valued and in which they value one another. And I think that the way that we need to do that is to continue to talk openly about the ongoing failures in our institutions and organizations, right? We need to hold on to these echoes of the past that continue to, you know, cascade around us. We need to tell the truth about how hard it is to scour away the residue of these structures of oppression, right? We are trying and we are not actually succeeding, but we're trying. And I think we need to tell the truth about that. And I think that we need to actively and continually choose not to engage with and not to embark on programs and projects that reinforce those structures, right? We have to grapple with asking ourselves as we move as organizations and institutions if we are operating on the premise of cultural, social, and moral deficits, of a need to regulate people's behaviors and selves, right? And so I, would call out in particular that we need to disarm our campus, and we need to support disarming SROs in Portland public schools. We need to decolonize our curriculum, right? We need to be talking about, from this anchor institution, a public institution that provides access to higher education to people of all kinds of backgrounds, first-generation college students, working class students, immigrant students, students of color, queer and trans students. We need to talk about how our community accesses and experiences this city, right? We need to talk about justice and access in the city of Portland, the region of Portland, as it becomes ever more unequal and exploitative, right? And I think that we need to be very active in our stance of rejecting solutions that are pushed from top down, that rely on the punishment and regulation of people who have historically been marginalized and oppressed. We have to operate from the principle that people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution, and we must place them closest to power. And I think that we're talking about a very different institution, right? We're talking about building a very different notion of how we govern ourselves, how we make decisions, and how we operate to scour away these structures and systems that we all are operating within and all are reinforcing all the time. I don't know what that will look like or feel like because I have not experienced it, but I do believe that it's possible, and I think that we build the road by walking. So I would encourage us to start walking.
I think I'm the member of this panel who is representative of the living, breathing echo of the past. I'm the senior citizen on the panel. But it also, I don't know how many of you have made any kind of study of ecology. That's where I started teaching, was at an environmental college in Wisconsin on the shores of Lake Superior, and I was taught a concept there called ground truthing. So what it comes down to is you have to get out on the beach, in the woods, in the lake, and find out what's really there. And that's kind of my role too, a little bit on this panel, and I try to make it my role in the classroom because in my own life, I have taken a different path than most academics. I came to it late. I came to the academy late. I came to it from being a professional community organizer, somebody who has, no doubt, a much longer criminal record than this entire panel combined. But I don't flatter myself with any comparison, but there's one person and one person only for whom we celebrate a national holiday. One person. And we just heard from him. And he was a convicted felon, okay? So I think it goes back to the question that Dr. Bates brought up, is like, do we focus on punishment? Do we focus on a retributive justice system? The other ground truthing piece that I can bring is that I was 17 when I went to, I was 17 when Dr. King was murdered, when he was assassinated. And I was sitting with a reverend in Chicago then when I found out about it, a place I wanted to move to called this, I grew up in Minneapolis, but this place I learned about was called the Southside Christian Center. And so that's where I moved after high school to live there. And it was, the Rev knew both Malcolm X and Dr. King, and Dr. Bates is exactly right if I can take the ground truthing from the Rev of that Southside Christian Center, because that's exactly how he talked, knowing both of these people personally. They were on an arc toward each other, not away from each other. So I think that the revisionist history that says it's a dichotomous relationship that we need to take a side on this side or that side. What I tell students in my classes, I teach nonviolence, I practice nonviolence. I'm an apprentice nonviolent practitioner, I should say. Is that I think if we just tweaked what Malcolm X said to by any nonviolent means necessary, that we would find them coming together perfectly. Because that's the true, in my mind, a creative way to approach conflict. And I've always appreciated what Grace Paley, the poet from New York, said about that. She said, "I'm a combative pacifist." And that sort of, to me, underlines what it means in the chant that Lisa led, no justice, no peace. So yeah, it might be a peaceable way to resolve conflict or to advocate for equality and justice. But it doesn't mean that it may be peaceable, but not necessarily peaceful. Nonviolence can be very robust. The very first list of ways to do it came out in 1973, and it was 198 different methods of nonviolence. That's a long list, and it's grown since then quite a bit. So I just want to say one more thing in terms of ground truthing. As a 17-year-old, just a couple of 3 months after Dr. King was murdered, I attended a church in Minneapolis. An African-American woman minister had just returned from Resurrection City, and she had a couple of really profound insights. This was Dr. King's last dream. Just as Gandhi's final dream was the Shanti Sena, the nonviolent army, Dr. King's last dream was Resurrection City and the Poor People's Campaign. And what her insights were, a couple of things. She said, first of all, it was so obvious being there literally on the ground truthing this, bringing this report back. She said, Dr. King is the only one who could have brought all those people together. These were poor whites from Appalachia and across the country, African Americans, Latinas, Latinos, all colors, every demographic of people who have been marginalized. He was the only one, she felt, that could have brought them together in a coalition that was destined at that point to fundamentally do the changes that we just heard about in this talk. That was one thing. The other thing she said was, we had a lot of talk in the Poor People's Campaign about reparations, and the Poor People's Campaign was linked with the Resurrection City, and she said, there's been some debate about this and talk about this, and she said, here's the analogy I'm going to offer you. If you're playing poker with somebody and that person's winning, and it comes to 4 in the morning and you catch them cheating, and they say, okay, I'll play fair from now on. It's no. That's not the way that this should be thought about. Reparations to people who have had so much theft need to go back to the beginning of the game. That's what Dr. King was talking about too, when he was talking about economic justice. To me, it means a fundamental shakeup of our economic system. So that's all I've got now.
You guys said everything. I'm a civil rights child and born in the south side of St. Louis, a project baby. They walked me from the hospital that I was born in, City Hospital number 1, to my apartment at 1305 South 12th Street, where I was the neighbor to about 300 other occupants in about a half of a block, 12 stories high. This was my introduction to environmental injustice. Seeing the pilfering smoke of Monsanto and Anheuser-Busch, and the 24-hour incinerary systems that were a part of the Project Everyday norm, and God knows you don't want to talk about what was in those incinerators. The Dr. King movement and him, as I remembered as a child, was always something that mesmerized me when I seen him. Moving forward to his speech in '67, I see this impassioned plea for political and social revolution, and defiantly rail against what King dubbed the three evils of modern American society: militarism, war, racism, and poverty. Dr. King could be easily described as a true 20th century prophet and prophetic man of God that will have had direct responsibility of being beholden to us in this 21st century. This particular remembrance speaks eerily to present day experience and looks strikingly similar to present day worldview. It has been said that this is the most radical speech, deeming it as infamous. However, I don't at all concur. I would reckon this work as a gift from God, a prophetic whisper and a clarion cry to the 21st century. When we reflect on these words, that I wish that I could say that this is just a passing phase in the cycles of our nation's life. Certainly times of war, times of reaction throughout the society, but I suspect that we are now experiencing the coming to the surface of a triple-pronged sickness that has been lurking within our body politic from its very beginning. That is the sickness of racism, excessive militarism, and militarism. It is true that I feel that prophetic voice breathed on us in 2016. When he spoke in these words, he said, "Yes, the hour is dark, and evil comes forth in the guise of good, in the times of double talk, when men in high places have high blood pressure of deceptive rhetoric and an anemia of concrete performance. We cry out against welfare, handouts to the poor, but generously approve an oil depletion allowance to make the rich richer." These are prophetic words that eerily mark where we are right now in this time. The unsettling force that Dr. King talked about in 1967 is resting upon us even now. As we see the new poor people becoming the blue-collar worker, as we see the new indigent being those that were poor, we hear a different voice that will take on a different turn. Martin Luther King reminded us that it was hard to escape the disillusionment and betrayal. Our hopes have been blasted and our dreams have been shattered. I am afraid today that the 20th century dream of Dr. Martin Luther King would become a 21st century nightmare. Unshackling the bonds of the minds of the people illiterate, that would not be given to the understanding of the privilege that we have in voice, to resurrect the old time saying that we will not be turned around, the freedom songs that were sang that would say we will not allow anybody to turn us around. Why? Because we're going to keep on walking. Somebody talk to me. Are you here this morning? Are you here this evening? Can I hear you breathe? Come on, talk to me. And it's going to take somebody breathing. And like Lisa said, we're going to have to walk. Somebody talk to me. We're going to have to walk till we reach freedom's way. There's a song that we sang in the Freedom Fighters. You know it. It says, "Ain't going to let nobody turn me around." How many of y'all know that? All get up on those vocal abilities right now, and I want you to sing it with me. Ain't gonna let nobody, come on. Oh, turn me, come on and say it. Oh, turn me, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. We gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, walking up the freedom way. Oh, ain't gonna let nobody, come on. I want you to hear to say it. Turn, oh, somebody. Oh, ain't gonna let nobody. Oh, we gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, walking up the freedom way. Now let me tell you something. Let me say something to you. If you was gonna help me turn around with that little bitty voice, now I want you to stand up on your feet right now and act like you came to make a difference. Come on here. Now, when I hear you, when I say turn me around, I want to hear you say turn me around, because these are the people that are going to do that. Isn't that right? I ain't going to let nobody. Come on, say it. Say it with me. Oh, say it, turn me. Oh, I ain't going to let nobody. Oh, we going to keep on walking, keep on talking, walking up the freedom way. Now that's a little bit better. Come on now.
Are you done?
I'm done.
I really did not want to have to follow a reverend at an MLK event. And this has confirmed my terror at that thought. I do want to ask for a favor. I have incredibly terrible allergies, and I'm wondering if we can move the flowers a little bit further away. Sorry, they're beautiful. Don't have the right genes for flowers. I really want to thank Dr. Grady-Willis for the invitation to participate in this panel, not just because I was really relieved when I answered the phone and realized I was not, in fact, in trouble with the Office of Global Diversity and Inclusion, but was invited to participate in such an amazing opportunity. For the students who are in the audience, I think a lot of times, particularly for those of us who come from sort of othered positions, we really have to think about what motivates us and what fills us with joy and ambition. And a lot of times people will come to me and be like, hey, if you do this, you get to do this other thing. And my school director in the audience, who's here in the audience one time, was like, hey, if you do this, you might get to meet the governor. And I'm like, I don't want to meet the governor. That's not interesting to me. This is what motivates me. Receiving a call from Dr. Grady-Willis to do this is what motivates me to do this work. And so I really want to thank you for the opportunity. I also want to say that I often talk about Black and brown communities together, and that is because that is my lived experience in thinking about how we are unified. But I do want to acknowledge that the Latino community carries a lot of anti-Black bias, and we have a lot of work to do in that front. And so when I unify those communities, I don't do it to be dismissive of that work that still needs to be done, but of how I was raised to see our struggles as struggles that we share. Rereading the speeches, I was struck by how much what Dr. King had said about racism and poverty seemed like they were words that were written last week. We are indeed living in a time where the historic unwillingness of the white community to invest in redressing racism means that Black community members, along with other communities of color, face significant disparities along a whole host of indicators. As I worked in homelessness research and homelessness work, I am not surprised by the dramatic disparities that African Americans or Native Americans experience. Rather, I am surprised that white people are surprised. We have not earned the right to be surprised by that. In reading the speech, though, I found it a little bit harder to connect directly to some of what Dr. King was talking about in terms of the evils of war. And being an overachiever, I decided that's what I wanted to think about for tonight. And in part because I know that we're still a country that welcomes anyone to come on the field to bleed, although really not anyone, but anyone from any race to come onto the field to bleed on a military field. But when they come home, we don't do much for them. And we know that police violence continues to destroy our communities. and to take the lives of Black and brown community members around the country, as we saw last summer. But reading in this speech, there's a lot about Vietnam. How many of us in this audience have any lived connection to Vietnam, the Vietnam War? Right, very few of us. And so that becomes a more distant memory for a lot of us. I also think there's a lot of ways in which how we think about and talk about war has changed since 1967 in ways that are deeply terrifying and interconnected. Our national borders mean less in the context of war. Our definition of what a war actually is has changed. Military actions have defined much of our, quote, war activities over the last 30 and 40 years. If we look at what we've done in Latin America, forever altering the path of Latin America with military interventions, were largely carried out by the CIA. And I'm not sure that that's a distinction that really matters anymore. We also have wars that happen within our borders, right? Our wars are not just external, they're internal. We had a war on drugs that was really a war on Black and brown communities, while also a war on Latin America. It can't be surprising that we now have a caravan of people seeking entrance into this country at our southern border when we look at our military actions around the way. We have a war on terror, also focused on another group of people of color. A war on terror that we bring home, but to never examine the terror of white supremacy. Rather, we have the Joint Terrorism Task Force. We have a highly militarized ICE. ICE just this week pulled a person of color off of a bus to interrogate them about their immigration status after they showed them an Oregon state driver's license. The guns of war that Dr. King warns us about in his speech, our local law enforcement now carry. I think here is one of the opportunities that we have for pan-ethnic and pan-racial organizing. We share much of the same struggles, and they're brought to us by war, and they're brought to us by violence. And my hope is that as we look at our own campus, as we think about what we can be doing next together to continue these efforts forward, to me I see a shared set of issues that revolve around police action, the military, and violence. The last thing I wanted to add was that when I was thinking about the wars that have happened in the past, I kept having one image come to mind, several images that had a couple of things in common. One, everyone I was thinking about was white, not surprising, but they were also all men. And this made me think that perhaps this evil of war is also a reflection on the evil of white masculinity and the white patriarchy. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just curious, just based on what folks shared, any thoughts? Anybody want to respond to anything someone else said? Want to elaborate? You don't have to. Just curious.
I just want some more singing, please.
I wanted to add, talking about my lived experience as a child growing up in South St. Louis, that when we look at environmental injustice, we see Dr. King in the 21st century still pointing the way. Everywhere in the United States where you find Dr. Martin Luther King Boulevard, you find environmental injustice.
Yes.
Wow. This is the age that I think that we can make those kind of gross differences that couldn't be made at that time. But there's no excuse for us not to be able to do that in present day. And as I conclude with my comment on this piece, we're in a city that has been deemed the whitest city in America and the whitest state in the country. The disproportions in our races could really be an example to the world as to how we really undo racism and how we work around changing the narrative of what that looks like. We're the people that can do that, right?
Or I'm not to the Reverend, but I ask this sincerely, just being here for just 2.5 years, there are things that give me pause, and so sometimes I wonder, are we collectively the people? So maybe I'm just in a sort of a pessimistic place right now, but I mean, given the reality of the Klan organizing not only in places like Oregon City, right, but in neighborhoods in Southeast Portland, given the fact that every time the city of Portland has made the news in the past month or so, it has not, it's not been around anything positive with respect to race. So, of course, I'd like to think that we're the people, but what, and this is not just directed to Reverend Mondainé, but anyone, what concretely, what steps need to be taken so that that can actually be done, particularly because Professor Bates correctly talked about just the importance of young people, but if we learn anything from other social movements, some of the most successful movements are not only all-class movements, but multi-generational ones. And so I really worry about this generational divide now. And so, I mean, what are some things that we can do, particularly cross-generation, to get that done? So, I don't know. Anybody?
Well, so one of my current projects with my friend and colleague Sharita Town, who's an artist and a professor at Portland Northwest College of Art here, is around Black history in our city. Yeah. And one of our principles that we're very interested in pursuing is how do we, on the question of intergenerational knowledge, how do we ensure that the history that we are telling has not been neutered in the same way that, often Dr. King's story is neutered. Yeah. So it's not enough to just know that some bad things happened and it was a long time ago, but we need to talk very openly and explicitly about, one, what was the resistance, what was the organizing, what was the alternative community spaces that were built under those conditions of very explicit oppression, but also to remember that it's not like, the Vanport flood happened and then there was segregation, ... and now here we are today. There's a lot of stuff that happened in between there, right? And so what do we know about, how do we talk about resistance in the Black community, Native community, Latino community to gentrification as it began to start around 2000, or the Max line, or the sort of conversations we're having today, and then how do we expand and understand that, politicize that history instead of constantly trying to deracialize and depoliticize it and then memorialize it in a way that's purely decorative, as opposed to really thinking about, what is it? But then we also need to understand and respect that young people are living in history now, right? Yeah. So what are the stories of someone who is 20 years old, 15 years old, 12 years old in this city? How can they tell us and inform us about what is happening in their lives? What is happening from their perspectives? How are they understanding and experiencing this place? How would they like to have voice and participation? And so to make it mutual, right? But we can't, I think so much of that history is, I don't want to say it's lost, it's been stolen away, it's been repressed, it's been erased. And I think we have to work very actively all the time to bring it back.
Okay, yeah. Anybody else?
So, I think I alluded to this at the beginning of my remarks. I think that the other non-Black communities of color have to talk about and address anti-Blackness. And that is the only way in which we can really do cross-racial organizing. We have to turn up for African Americans. We have to understand that a lot of us come from countries that have their own racial hierarchies, and that what that means here might function differently, but we're bringing that from there. I'm often amazed because I am the child of civil rights parents, the number of Latinos I meet who don't know the legacy of Cesar Chavez and the cross-racial organizing work that happened with Filipinos and African Americans and Chicanos. And by not knowing our own history, I think that that allows us to perpetuate these actions and ideas around anti-Blackness. And so I think that for white people, it also means that when we talk about racial equity, we have to center on Black communities if we really want to advance the work.
Black people are tired of apologizing for having to tell other people that Black lives matter. And Black people are also tired of being melted into the pot that says we are people of color. We are African Americans. And our conservatism towards immigration is for a reason. We were brought here in chains, beloved. And there was no escaping from that until the time that is now. You say to me, how is it that we can make a difference here? Oh yeah, you can make a difference. Number one, you gotta stop being so quiet. Did y'all hear me? Make some noise. And I think that that's the big problem. We're too quiet about what goes on. For 50 years, we were lulled into a place where we thought it was okay. And in 2016, we woke up and discovered that there were roaches in the kitchen. Somebody talk to me. But we are the people that understand what raid is, isn't that right? So I'm going to tell you something. You're going to have to paint yourself colored. And you're going to have to come out of the places where you have just become merely allies, holding your hands up in help when we are not yet in the battlefield, and making the suggestions as to how it can be different in our midst. But once we get into the battlefield, you back off and go back into opaque. Somebody talk to me. What you're going to have to do is pick your fight and say, this is who I am, and this is where I'm standing, and I'm standing on the side of righteousness, whether you like it or not, neighbor. Somebody talk to me. And not only that, you're going to have to stop putting up with it at your dinner tables, at your clubhouses, at your places of work. Anytime you hear it, anytime you see it, you're going to have to call it out and say, that is not me. And that is not where we live. So because it's more of y'all than it is us, come on, talk to me. This is why I know we're the people that can do it, right? Okay. I love you.
So I just want.
Oh, go ahead. Well, I want to say something very explicitly about that, because yes, I mean, Black people, we're here because of rapacious colonialism,
yes,
racial capitalism,
yes,
and also like other people of color are here in the United States because of colonialism and rapacious racial capitalism on a global scale. Right?
Right.
So I don't see any, I think we also must learn and do our work to be in solidarity with, you know, communities who have come here as refugees, communities who have come here escaping destabilizing forces of the United States, understand ourselves as Americans in this world and the way that our country, you know, operates globally, right? Yeah. So I think we all have to, you know, and yes, we have to understand anti-Blackness as being a fulcrum point for racial hierarchy, and also as Black folks reject an assimilation into xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, classism. I mean, we have to do that ourselves as well in our own organizations and institutions, or we are not going to move forward. And in a city like Portland, we have to ally also around working class people, which is not to say that white working class people don't have a bunch of stuff to work on. but we also have, we don't have the numbers to develop the kind of movement if we cannot get all that together.
Okay. Tom, did you want to?
Well, actually, let's let this thread go out because I have sort of a short commercial.
Okay.
You know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is a however, not a but. But absolutely. The resilience of our people is very plain to see. And to understand the need for allies and for accomplices is nothing less than historic, especially with an organization like the NAACP, as its founding was a response to lynching of African Americans in Springfield. Being that we were partnered with the white constituency of people like Story Moore and Overton White, partnering with people like W.B. Du Bois, made it possible for us to create this kind of foundation. So it is imperative that we seek those alliances and allies, but it is also imperative that we forget not the 20 million or so Africans that were killed on the way to this land. And it is also important to note that there is a stark difference of the lived experience of the African American, his slave experience, and the experiences that came predicated from those things. So it is a complicated history, and none that can be unthreaded in this moment at time. But it is worth saying that the African Americans have a standalone and must not be, it must not be allowed to be insulated or to be engulfed in such a big melting pot that it is absolutely forgotten and annihilated, and the understanding of where we come from and what we, where we are yet to go, be washed out somehow. And that is somehow my fear.
Okay. If I, may I? Yeah, thank you. And maybe this is a way to deal with both of these issues. I personally absolutely think it's imperative. And so I say it not just as an academic, but you know, as a parent, someone who co-parents 3 black children, right? That it's absolutely imperative that we embrace that notion of self-determination more than just on the second day of Kwanzaa, right? So it's really important for us as black folk to do that. But I also think it's important for us to have an expansive view, not only of our current reality, but also of our history that may force us to look at some issues a bit more uncomfortably. For instance, we often talk about the nature of enslavement in the so-called New World and the experiences of enslaved Africans, and that's absolutely true. But it's only been recently that there's now been more of a substantive discussion of the fact that our indigenous brothers and sisters have also been enslaved,
yes.
And for hundreds of years, right? So it's important to acknowledge that, yet also go even a step further. And I say this as somebody from Denver, right, from Rocky Mountain West. One of the things that we often celebrate is this notion of the Buffalo Soldier. Right? Bob Marley, a very famous song. Well, in one context, those Buffalo Soldiers were really important because those were actually black soldiers, U.S. Army combat troops who helped to win their own freedom in the U.S. Civil War, right? And so that's really important. That's absolutely something to celebrate. But what we often tend to try to either sanitize or have euphemisms around is the fact that those very same black U.S. soldiers were often on the front lines of the genocide of indigenous communities throughout the U.S. West.
That's right. That's
right? And
That's
so
right.
it's really, really important. So maybe this is a way to you know,
And,
kind of
well,
do both.
and
Yeah.
we also
Yeah.
often sanitize or don't talk about indigenous nations owning chattel
Absolutely.
slaves. who were
Absolutely.
black, right?
Absolutely.
And
Particularly
not,
Cherokee.
and,
Yeah.
and not emancipating them
Right.
That's
after the
right.
Civil War. So I think
Yeah.
we have
Yeah.
spent many hundreds of years
Yeah.
in an oppressive structure
Yeah.
that pits people against one another in incredibly complicated
Yeah.
ways. I mean, right now we're talking only about race and indigeneity, but we could talk about all these other metrics as well. And we can't imagine that we're going to work through that,
Right.
you know, in a couple years via social media, right? And it's going to look really ugly, and it's going to be very uncomfortable, and it's going to be very transformative, and we have to do it. And I don't think we're going to get through it during my lifetime,
Right.
but we have to be doing it.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
holding all of that mess and being very ruthless with ourselves, and very honest in
Yeah.
what it is that we're doing.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so I thought when I was 17, it would be by the time I was 18. And tonight I thought it would be by the end of the panel, but okay.
We still have audience Q&A. Someone may have the answer.
I hope so. One of the things I really want to echo very briefly is the notion of intergenerational importance in our movements. That's the kind of coalition that is beyond the lateral identity group to identity group, but goes intergenerationally, and that's exceedingly important. There was a young man who was studying nonviolence in India for 3 years after he finished serving his prison sentence for resisting the draft into the Korean War. He's the same age as my father would have been, and when he came back to the United States in the mid-1950s, he was intercepted as he was on his way to earn his graduate degree in divinity in the Deep South. This is Reverend Jim Lawson, and he was the original trainer, the original nonviolence trainer. Dr. King took his trainings in nonviolence from Reverend Lawson, and they worked very closely together. Reverend Lawson is the one King recruited to go to Nashville. He said, we are going to break the back of Jim Crow segregation, starting in the northern tier of the South and working our way south from there. And that's exactly what they did. So Reverend Lawson was in Nashville for months. The same segregated system that had existed for decades, if not hundreds of years, certainly since Plessy v. Ferguson, was undertaken. The battle was undertaken in February of 1960, after all these decades of legal struggles and everything else. And so these students went out and just did nonviolent civil resistance and met violence with nonviolence, opening a great gap of public sympathy. And they started in February. By Easter, they had achieved a complete victory. The mayor had said, we're going to desegregate this town. That was pretty impressive. So they went on to struggle after struggle, learning as they went. Reverend Lawson was the main trainer in 1963 in Birmingham, etc. So he's coming to PSU April 24th. I hope everybody will attend that evening. I believe it's going to be in the Native American Center. I'm very proud of my student group, Students United for Nonviolence. They're the organizers of that evening. Beyond that, though, I would encourage everybody who's interested in getting really high-level nonviolence training, education and training, from Reverend Lawson himself and from a team of us who will be doing this. It's the 6th James Lawson Institute, and will be held, again, right here at PSU. That's an application form. It's pretty competitive, and it's on the website, and it's open now. The James Lawson Institute, you can find it easily online. So I think it's very important to acknowledge his contribution. He was basically 3 months older than Dr. King. They were a team, a lot of mutual respect, and it went on from there. I think I just want to mention one final thing, is that I just did a survey, and we're all aware of this, but I really want to reinforce this idea that the civil rights movement was a significant improvement on Gandhian nonviolence. And then beyond that, the questions arose like, okay, who improved on their model? And that's why Reverend Lawson got a hold of me in 2012. He was so distraught with the amazing potential that he saw in the Occupy movement, and he said, they should have at least learned all the lessons we learned, and they're not doing it. They have this enormous potential, and he said, so we're going to start some new teaching. And so we've been doing this starting in 2013. First, a couple of them were in Nashville. Then we've been moving around the country. We did at UCLA Labor Center. Last summer was at Wesleyan University in Ohio. And this is, it's coming to PSU. So I would encourage anybody who's interested to apply for that. Plenty of scholarships available.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And this is the time, thank you, to open the conversation up. Everyone.
Okay, first of all, thank you to the panel. My name is Charles Fong. I'm a member of the Portland NAACP. Good to see you out there, Mr. President. And I actually made a comment last night, and I was lucky enough to be first, and I do want to follow up on that. I want to talk a little bit about money, and it's not because I'm Asian. That was a joke, so you could laugh. Thank you. So last night we talked about poverty. So let me just start with poverty. Last night, the figure that was shared with the group was that African American families own 10 cents to the dollar in terms of net wealth in America. But that was pre the Great Recession. The figures now for an African American household in America is anywhere from a low of 3 cents to a high of 8 cents per dollar compared to a white family, okay? So I averaged it last night at 6 cents. So what I want to revisit is this $41 million that's left in the hardest hit fund. And all I want to say and ask for some advice here is to give you just a little bit of background. President Obama sent the state of Oregon $315 million to help, quote, the hardest hit families during our Great Recession. And this money was designed to help families that had fallen behind on their mortgage for various reasons, you know, illness, underemployment, layoff, you name it, okay? So the data as we speak right now is that less than 10% of these families in Oregon that were from communities of color got this money. So what we're talking about is communities of color got about $18 million and everybody else got the balance, okay? So we have $41 million left, and I think we should fight for it because we deserve it. And one last thing, if I can just kind of drill this down to a really good analogy. 2 years ago, the Oregonian published a story about a nuisance house in Tigard. And this is a house where there was all kinds of criminal activity. People were complaining about this house. So the Oregon ran a story about it. Turns out that this homeowner received $30,000 in this fund that I'm referring to save her house. Now, about 3 months later, the Willamette Week does a story about the last African-American family in Northeast Portland, okay? A nice, you know, like what, 60-year family, African-American in Northeast Portland, okay? And how they were struggling and how nobody, the City of Portland, the state of Oregon, had the wherewithal to help this family. So on one hand, we have a family who got $30,000, and of course they happen to be white, but then we all know that 90% of the people who got this money was not communities of color. So then we got an African-American family that got, anybody want to take a guess how much they got? 0. And I don't think that's right. So I'm going to pivot back to you guys. I want to know how to non-violently get this $41 million for communities of color. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anybody? Thank you.
Well, okay, so I think from a policy perspective, I think the thing that's happened in this region, Oregon in general, between the time of ARA and the Hardest Hit Fund and some of the other funds that have come out now, is that more of our public policy making institutions have started to think a bit more about what things like hardest hit or most impacted, or prioritizing their resource allocations in a very different way. I think this, the sort of methods and framing around the impact on the economy in a macro sense, but also on individual well-being, health, and thriving, and opportunity, etc., of distributing resources like this to people of color and closing the wealth gap. There's that's very well documented, and I think there's lots of methods for doing that work. And I think that might be an avenue for injecting that into a policy conversation about, essentially, which is how do you prioritize resources to get the most bang for the buck, to describe what that bang is. I mean, that's a very short-term way of addressing that.
So would you be willing to partner with the NAACP and help us craft the strategy?
So I wouldn't describe that as my favorite thing to do. I have other favorite things that I'm working on. So it's kind of funny. I mean, I'm happy to share with you some names of people who could work on such a metric.
Yeah.
But we all have we're all doing our work, right? And we all have our lanes and our priorities that we're trying to push. So I think it's awesome that this is yours. Yeah,
no, I want to
cheer you on.
It's not about me. I want to share it. What if I give you some of the 41 million?
That would be inappropriate. It would be inappropriate.
We have a question on this side.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hello. So I went to school here, undergrad, and every time I'm here I feel smarter, first of all. So thank you all. I've had a variety of y'all as professors over the past, oh my gosh, too long. But what I really wanted to talk about is kind of this policy conversation around the distribution of wealth and education, in particular in the way that it's allocated in the state of Oregon. Okay. So where we have, I entirely agree that we have done a lot better at distributing and prioritizing funds that come to us maybe more federally funded, or that are more in the know of what people know the money that we have to spend. But when we're talking about education funding and the way that it's currently allocated, I went to a high school that is in one of the wealthiest areas in this city, and we had a new baseball stadium put in. We had flat screen TVs everywhere. We had brand new books every single year. And then I moved to Portland, and I'm working in Jefferson High School, where we don't have enough, we don't have enough at times money to keep the lights on, so we need to bus our students to other schools to ensure that they can have the summer education that they deserve. So how do we, from a policy perspective and from a dismantling the white supremacy that is inherent in that structure, go about changing things when they are so intrinsically part of the way that Oregon chooses to fund education? I honestly think that I learned about that when I was 15, and I've been pissed off ever since. And I haven't seen it change, and I haven't seen, the conversation's there, we're having the conversation, but there's no action behind it. And I would love some feedback and suggestions as to how to put some action and some heat under the bottoms of folks in positions of power to make that happen, if anyone has any thoughts.
So urban planning is a profession predicated on not working with school districts, right? So that's a huge thing. Yeah. And so I'm not going to pretend to be an education person, but I support you in being really pissed off. I'm from Texas. Everyone can laugh. Yes, I'm from Texas. But people have been suing the state of Texas for these same issues since I was a kid. I learned about this when we were 8 years old because of the disparities between the way that the property taxes were allocated. It's really tough work, and I don't really have any great ideas other than finding other people who share your fire to address this. I know that we've had a lot more people of color elected to school boards around the region, and they're trying to gain some traction. But this is not, I mean, urban planners love to be like, oh, we don't know anything about the schools, bye. Because it is such a serious issue. So I don't know if anyone else has actual school knowledge.
I think there may be some folks, well, because I don't. I think there may be some folks here in the room who do, if they're willing to.
Oh, the Dean of the School of Education is here. Yes!
Hello, yes, I'm the Dean of the College of Education. So this is really wonderful for me. I don't often get to hear this kind of talk. I'm on my own campus. I go places and hear people talk about this stuff elsewhere, but it's nice to be home and listen and be engaged. So the funding model is screwed up. And in fact, there was a report released recently by the Joint Committee for School Success. I don't know if you can look that up. You can see, and they're talking about funding and the way that the schools are funded. And in Oregon, you had a cap on property taxes, and so we're not getting, speaking of the bang for the buck, there. And so we're relying on income taxes, and the way that gets distributed is not appropriate. So Oregon, I think, Oregon's education system, if you look at the Oregon Department of Education, the Chief Education Office, there's a real focus right now on equity. And there's a lot of discussion about equity. I think though, and one of the things that I've been arguing for is that we really need to think about making sure that the schools that have the most need are getting the most support. And so until we can turn that situation around, we're not going to see major improvements in that area. And so really schools are funded based on wealth. And if you live in a wealthy neighborhood, wealthy area, then you're going to have a school, and the school reflects those inequities in the society, and that's a structural problem that I think really needs to be corrected. I mean, I think we have an opportunity in Oregon, because I've lived in a few states, and this is the first one where equity is sort of written into public policy, and I think that's significant. Whether we think it's real or not, it is there, and I think we need to think about what that looks like and how we realize that. And I think school funding and thinking about different school funding models is going to be significant. The legislature needs to be pushed on this. And I think we need to really help them understand that nothing will change, nothing will shift until schools like Jefferson get the support that they need. And if we're really going to be equitable, right, then Jefferson should be getting way more funding than Lincoln, right? Because Lincoln has what it needs, and the children that go to Lincoln School have parents who can support them in all kinds of ways. And so I think that's the conversation we need to be having. I also think that we need to be more involved in schools. I know we are busy people and we have a lot going on, but I think the schools need volunteers. They need people to come and read to kids. They need mentors for kids. They need folks who are going to be present and available to help and assist. And I think that would make a significant difference. And I know we're all stretched pretty thin, but that human capital piece is really important. And then the other thing I'll say, and I'll sit down, is as a dean of education, is the challenge, one of the major challenges we have is getting folks of color to actually consider teaching as a profession. And so we really need folks of color to think about it. And my view is you don't have to, teaching is no longer a 30-year profession, right? And so it's not a lifetime commitment necessarily, but I think about teaching 5 or 10 years, and particularly in the most needy contexts and environments. I think schools and colleges of education need to be partnering with colleges of urban planning, Black studies, gender, race, and nations, and thinking about how it is that we partner together to infuse our curriculum with more of this kind of knowledge, this kind of understanding. One of the things I try to do is share this information with my faculty, but it doesn't always reach the students. And so, and then we're looking at curriculum and curricular transformation processes, but we need to be more partnered, I think, across the university so that we can enhance schools and colleges of education and enhance the curriculum, but also improve and do the work to improve schools. All right, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And for those, so for those of you who don't know, so it's Dr. Marvin Lynn, okay? He's been here, what, 2 years? 2 years, and he's so bad, it's gone from the School of Education to the College of Education. So that should, and anybody who's familiar with PSU culture knows that's a really big deal structurally. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in on this particular issue? Yes, sir.
The legislative piece is really important, and I'm glad that you brought it in. The policy, the equity is built into the policy, as you stated, but it's going to take the consistent pressure of our people, as Lisa Bates talked about, the pressure coming from the inside to the outside, and our people showing up and making sure that those things are consistent. So when we could talk to our people and make a big enough noise, and we'll partner with you in the NAACP to get that kind of work done so that our people can be on the present and those policies can be instated.
Yeah, absolutely. I see a hand right here. Is there a mic?
Dr. Winston decided to take over.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oops. I'm sorry. I didn't know there was a line.
So on the note of policy, I have a question about organizing and collaboration in the Black community specifically. So one thing that I've noticed about institutions in Portland specifically is that there's a lot of the Black community is very underrepresented in any sort of power, educational institution, politically, and that's why you don't see a whole lot of, equitable policies, because there aren't people to really defend them or fight for them. So I was wondering if you had any recommendations about just strategies or tactics for organizing in the Black community across culture, across generations, across class, because I've noticed that there are some schisms, like there are a lot of Black people here, there's just a lot of difference and in the Black community, and I think healing conversations that need to be had. So I was just curious about any sort of spaces that existed for that.
So let me unpack one sort of implied assumption of what you're saying there, which is that there's something that is somehow more, and maybe this is not what you meant. I don't think the Black community here is more different or more like internally diverse than in other places. And I think we often have sort of like a mythos of a political solidarity among all Black people that does not exist actually. That is work to be done, not only sort of externally and looking at Black communities, say, how do I organize those people? Like we have to be doing internally. Post an era of we are all like fighting against Jim Crow, an obvious terroristic system, but like the moment that you get into a conversation about the things I study around housing or urban planning or neighborhoods or whatever, you immediately begin to have a much wider array of interests, and you have communities that are immigrant oriented or that have different cultures and different class interests. So we've never had like a unitary solidarity politic. That's always something that we've had to build, and that it's relational. Like all organizing is relational, and I think that there is a challenge here around fragmentation of place, because there was a period of time in which almost all the Black folks, including the Ethiopian immigrant and every Black person who moved here or was from here or whatever, was all living sort of in the same neighborhoods, and now we don't all live together, and so there's more relational work to be done. So I mean, how can that happen? Like, pay some organizers, build relationships, talking continuously, figuring out what people want. I think the other issue though is in the meantime, while these tables, decision-making spaces, et cetera, are being crafted, if they do not have Black voices or a diversity of Black voices at the table, I take pretty seriously what Angela Glover Blackwell's Black woman who founded Policy Link said about that, which is like, you don't walk away from the table. If you're there at the table and you notice that absence, you point out that absence, but then like do your darndest to represent, to connect back, to bring, you know, what you can to the space while you additionally make room for more chairs. Right, and so like what can be brought into the room with knowledge, with learning, with relationships that people build to make sure that our organizations and our institutions just don't go along business as usual while we like wait for a person to emerge who's ready to like come to that space.
Can I respond?
Or wants to come to that space even.
I wasn't referring to any sort of singular Black politic. I was just saying that there, and I think that it was expressed, there's a need for intergenerational dialogue. There's a need for dialogue across culture, across class. And there's a need for those spaces to happen so that Black people can advocate in the context of white institutions.
So I would go to Portland African American Leadership Forum, I would go to Black Community of Portland, I would go to Beyond Black. I think there's a lot of spaces that are emergent in that way. That may or may not be as legible from like a 30,000 foot view, but I think when you start to build the relationships and hang with folks and you sort of like find out what those emergent spaces are in which those conversations are happening.
And let me just, Sister Marcia, and you folks were waiting, I am so sorry, I didn't realize there was a queue forming, so yeah.
Hi, I'm Bora Harris, and my focus is regarding identity, from whence I came, the experience, what I experienced from where I came. I'm very big on inclusiveness and equity and so forth, but it is so important that African Americans know their history. The experience that we had being enslaved and brought here would be different than an experience that someone else may have had. So I'm not saying that we do not blend together, but it's so important that we know this history and we instill this in our children. I was born in Arkansas. I drank from a water fountain that had the label colored. And I carefully tipped to a fountain that had the label white. And I recognized that the flavors of the waters were no different. It was mindsets that made the changes there. So basically, you know, we were colored and transitioned into people of color. So it's so important that we are able to identify instead of in a box as people of color when there are certain perspectives or certain things taking place to be able to identify that this is Black. I did a study several months ago on Komen, the African American Initiative, the breast cancer disparities being 41% higher in African American women in the US. So oftentimes people would allude to, oh, people of color, the breast cancer mortality rate is 41%, so I had to be very specific, but you know, cautiously and carefully say, no, African American women has this disparity there. So I know there was conversation regarding identifying and people of color, which is wonderful. We are going to work together because we all have some of the same disparities and some of the same issues, but there are occasions where we need to identify from which we came and what we went through. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
One thing that I've been thinking about, you know, I love this speech because it's really a lens to look at a lot of the social issues of today, racism, poverty, and militarism, and I would add climate change and climate or environmental degradation. But I keep thinking about the ways that capitalism is driving so much of this, and that when we keep talking about wealth, and I think about my parents were always like, okay, Roberta, we got to accumulate wealth. And we never accumulated enough, and we would accumulate and lose it and accumulate. And I'm tired of the discourse of wealth. One, because I can't wrap my head around it. I've never experienced it, economic wealth. And I also sometimes feel like it directs me. I sometimes think it sends me down a path that of the capitalist machine, that I'm constantly thinking about accumulation, and not some of the more fundamental human rights and human needs that a just society should provide. Yeah, that's all I got.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I know folks are going to respond. Just want to give everyone a heads up. We've got 10 minutes left. So who wants to?
Yes to all of that, right? So I'm working in homelessness now, and it's the most dramatic example of what happens when we don't actually give people homes, food, access to education and jobs. And I kind of just walk around with this half smile on my face, and I'm like, well, until we all burn it all down, I don't really know what we're gonna do, because I don't, right? There's things that we can do to help people, but until we have a really hard conversation within our society about redistributive policy, about rethinking our structures completely, I don't see how any of this changes. And that's what I really struggle with now, because it's like, I mean, there's things I like about our society, but like Dr. Bates was saying at the beginning, she doesn't know what it looks like next. I don't either. I know that what we have now has produced this nightmare. And so to me, the only way we escape that is to dismantle it. But I don't know what comes next. But I share the pain and the frustration.
Good. Okay, we want to honor you folks who've been waiting. I think we can decide.
Hi. When I look at the enormity of the situation that we're facing, the other person mentioned climate change, and I see as the climate crisis continues and resources dwindle and the militarization of our society becomes more entrenched and the militarization of the police continues to focus more on communities of color, is there a way to build a wide-scale civil resistance? And I don't know if Professor Hastings or others have an idea of what has been done historically. I know SNCC did work on that, and the American Friends Service Committee in the Vietnam era, of how to address the really blatant fascism that we're seeing in our streets. White gangs just wandering around the streets of Portland. I'm worried that we're going to see another situation like Mulligatawsarah in the 90s, where these white gangs are being given the license to go out. We've got the military force of the police, and then these paramilitary forces. How can we organize as a community in a wide-scale civil resistance to oppose fascism in this crisis?
Not all at Everyone's once. Looking at Professor Hastings because you mentioned his name. Let's hear them. No? Actually, wait, anybody in the large room want to respond? This is a really important question. Well, I'm going to say only because you've had the open. That's the only why. That's the only reason why I say no, but maybe afterward. We're good? Okay, yes, yes.
It seems to me there's any number of smaller organizations doing some of the work that's being discussed here tonight, and especially here in Portland. Almost any day of the week you can find some organization doing some part of that work on the ground in real time with a specific focus. And it may just be that we need to find the organization that best syncs up with our values and our interests, and see if what the work they're doing is work that we want to be a part of. But there's any number of opportunities to be doing that work.
I'm sorry, can you mention a couple of those organizations? Do you find them on Facebook?
Oh, sure,
or?
like Resist ICE. They just had a big event on Saturday. That's one. Disarm Portland, Hands Up Portland or Disarm Portland. Teresa Rayford's group. I'm sorry, Don't Shoot Portland. I would say, what's that? Okay, Portland Assembly is another one. So I think if you get on like any kind of social media feed with one of those groups, you'll see a whole listing of other groups. Or go to the KBOO Radio events page. They list quite a few events going on of groups like I'm talking about, groups that are active in resistance. Critical resistance, there you go. There's another one. What's that? Portland Resistance. Okay, so.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's Professor Marlene Howell, WGSS. Who's next? We've got.
There's been a few people on your left.
Good evening. My name is Mike. I'm a grad student here at PSU. I just wanted to make a couple comments to respond to the discussion. I know the lady over here spoke about identity. So I wanted to just reflect on a couple of quotes that I know from MLK that are not too often repeated. I know the day before he was assassinated, he said he was tired of marching, right? Because what has marching really done for us as a people? And when I say us, specifically talking about so-called black people, because we know we're not black, we know we're not African American. These things are just labels that were given to us. So and another one that he spoke about was when after the so-called advances in desegregation, he feared that he had integrated his people into a burning house. One thing we got to understand is when we're trying to make a coalition with the same people who have oppressed us, we're going to get too far. That's why we've been marching for this for so long. We got to understand that as a people, even going back from slavery times, because I know that was brought up a few times, we have enemies, right? It's just the fact of the matter. If someone is killing your people daily, even till today, and like the brother up here brought up about Black Lives Matter, we have to protest to say Black Lives Matter in 2019 now, then there's a problem. And yes, the system would have to be dismantled, but we as a people first have to come to the knowledge of who we are as a people, because for those who didn't know, slavery is actually prophesied in the Bible. When you go into Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 68, the Lord prophesied to the children of Israel that we would go into slavery on slave ships. We are the people of the Bible. We are the children of Israel. That's our true nationality. We aren't black people. You know, and when I say the children of Israel, I'm talking about so-called blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans. We're all the same people. We've all gone through some of the same plights. We all have been oppressed by the same people. You know, so the first thing we got to do is to stop seeing each other as enemies and treat each other with respect and love and build up our nation. We got to focus on us. We can't continue to focus on putting effort to building up, like I said, a coalition with people who are not going to let you advance, but only so far, you know, because they know the biggest threat to American society is a unified black family and a unified black nation or black community, black people. As long as we're out here hating each other and killing each other, they're happy with that. But we as a people need to first come back to the knowledge of who we are, and we need to start applying God's law, statutes, and commandments, thus saith the Lord. And that's in the Bible. The oppression about, you know, how we would have no knowledge of our, let me just pull that out for you real quick, and I'm going to just take one more minute.
Actually, if you can,
15 more seconds.
Excuse me, if you could just
I'll take 15 more seconds.
Well,
like
I'm gonna give you 30 seconds,
okay.
but I just
yes, sir.
But okay, go ahead.
So this is the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28, and verse 64. It says, "And the Lord shall scatter thee among all people from one end of the earth even to the other, and there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thy fathers which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. And among these nations shalt thou find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest, but the Lord shall give thee there a trembling heart, and failing of eyes, and sorrow of mind. And thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shalt have none assurance of thy life. And the Lord is going to bring us into slavery again on ships. These things fit our people. These are the curses of Deuteronomy 28. It was prophesied that we would be living in the worst communities. It was prophesied that we wouldn't have anything of our own. It was prophesied that we would have to go to our enemies for every single thing. These things is what they don't teach us. And I know we got the Reverend up here, but these things aren't taught in Christianity, in the Christian church, because Christianity is just another tool of white supremacy. So we as a people need to come to the knowledge of who we are, because they're not teaching us to keep the commandments. We got to keep the commandments of God. That's how we're going to get out of our plights. That's what we have to do to get out of our situation.
Okay. Thank you. I want to talk to you, though, because I embrace the term black and African American. But anyway, we can talk later, afterward. What I want to do, because we're almost at time, but I want to honor, because these folks have been here, if you can just kind of be brief in your remarks. We've got two folks over here, and then there was one person who's been waiting patiently on this side. Let's hear from those folks, and then we'll bring everything to a close. Can we do that, folks? All right, thank you for your patience. Appreciate it.
I'll be as brief as it can be. My name is Benjamin. I'm not a student. I've been here about 2 years. So part of my mission here is to research this city and to see why it is the way it is, why things are so disparate between the racial classes and such and such. What I learned is that there are institutions that help implement on a very legal level the racism in the city, things like Portland Development Commission, things like the Portland Business Alliance. You know, these entities still exist on a very high level in the city and are still implementing new programs that implement sort of the echoes of these past racist programs like urban renewal zones that went in the 70s and 80s. And so with the future horizon, these programs that were incubated here at PSU, things like opportunity zones, things like residential infill projects, things like eco districts that are mass gentrification projects that will create racial divides in the city and other cities. What can we do as citizens to help this university understand that high-level partnership with entities like the Portland Business Alliance is a it's something that is not valued by the person that is oppressed by their policies, specifically houseless people, but also historically black folks throughout the city.
Okay. So, Keith, I don't know if anyone wants to, I tell you what we'll do, because we're going to give everybody 30 seconds, the panelists, and so if you want to respond to that specific question, you can do it at that time or maybe after we finish formally, okay? Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go over here.
Hi, I'm going to keep this really brief. I was going to make it a question, but now it's a statement, and it's about gentrification and the urban renewal program or funds. I just want to let everybody know that you should pay attention to what you're paying on your taxes. There's been gentrification that has taken place in Northeast Portland, and I live in East County, and I noticed that I was paying for urban renewal funds, but did not qualify for any of them. I called for years, and they kept telling me, I'm sorry, you're outside of the zone. So you're paying for things that supposedly now the rich that have taken over our communities are getting the advantage of being able to take advantage of those funds, but the people that really need them are not getting them. So yeah, that's an issue, and I just wanted to make everybody aware to keep aware of what you're paying on your taxes.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we've got one last speaker from the larger room, and then we'll give everyone 30 seconds on the panel. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, about 4 or 5 years ago, I saw a presentation that argued that the historical construct of our species has been one based on an aggression model, which was argued actually as necessary for the preservation of our species, for for us to get to here, but that in order for us to evolve as a species, the fundamental model of our sociological construct needs to be based on empathy. And that is where we need to go. And it's interesting because what I see is that is actually, I'm seeing some development of that in the millennials and younger generations, and they get trashed and called snowflakes for it. And so I'm curious for the panel, do you see the arc of the moral universe moving towards empathy?
Okay, thank you. And with that, we will, which direction do we want to go? Want to move from here? Okay.
I want the path of the universe to move towards justice and equity. Maybe that takes empathy, maybe that takes laws and rules, maybe that takes a new society, I don't know. But that's kind of what I'd like to see. I just want to thank everyone for the chance to share ideas. I'm here for the cross-racial organizing work and the hard conversations. And I also just want to acknowledge that in talking about Latino and Black communities, sometimes we also forget that there are Latinos who are Black, and to make sure that we hold space for that as well.
Thank you.
Undoing racism is an extremely complex topic. And I'm one that embraces the idea of the empathetic notion more like in this frame. There's something that I embrace, and I say it all the time. I'm one of those people that believe that green and yellow pumpkins become golden yellow carriages, and that white mice become footsmen, and etc. And there are glass slippers for everybody that wants to dream. It seems oversimplistic sometimes in the ways that we put how to do this. And sometimes simple is the best way. Simple is just not putting up with it anywhere and making the noise that we know that we can make and becoming the arm, hand, foot, or mouth that brings us to the place of that kind of empathy that the gentleman just spoke of. It is real simple, even though it's complicated.
You have really been a patient group of people, thank you. And yeah, I think it's down to what Dr. King said. It's either nonviolence or non-existence.
So my thoughts, I guess these are somewhat in reflection to this last crop of questions, which have to do with sort of specific policy tools. One of the thinkers that I draw from quite often is a Black geographer named Clyde Woods, and he talks about, he says the same tools that are used by the coroner are used by the surgeon, right? The scalpel for the autopsy can be life-giving in the hands of this other intent. But we have to ask ourselves if those tools are too rusty. So I think as we do this work of trying to pull apart our institutions and our organizations, we have to ask that very carefully. Are there tools that can be used differently when they are in service of self-determination by the communities who have experienced marginalization and disenfranchisement, or do those tools need to get thrown away? And I think that those are really hard questions, and continually asking ourselves, what are our intentions? What do we understand about our history? And how do we choose a different path forward? Is that really, really hard work that we have to do if we want to move ourselves on this path forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And well, first of all, can we give this panel collectively a round of applause? And I just want to use 20 seconds to say two things. I really sincerely believe in this notion of conversation and dialogue. Sometimes it can get messy, right? But I think it's worthwhile in the end for every voice to be heard. It's difficult work, but I think it's really important work. And the last thing I want to say, and I'm going to be given for this, but I have to. I know that this individual has already been thanked, but I really have to. Yes, I'm biased because we've been married for 26 years. But Professor Lisa Michelle Grady-Willis has done an extraordinary job in terms of really insisting on the integrity of a two-day event this year, which meant all that much more work for her. And then on top of everything, my dad passed away last week. She was in Denver with me, helping to hold it down for an entire week, and then literally came here yesterday, just hitting the ground running. And so I would really appreciate if you could give my soulmate a much-deserved round of applause.
He knows yeah, okay. Perfect segue. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you all for being a part of our two-night exploration of the legacy of Dr. King. Remember the connection when we talk about that notion of echoes, that it's not all about right now and it's not all about back then, but it's about recognizing what it means, right? To look at what the echoes are and what is necessary to move forward, right? We can't do it if we just focus on here or just focus on there. It has to be some true understanding, right, in order to move forward. Thank you all. Hope to see you all next year. Final round of applause for our illustrious panel.